Good afternoon, everybody. Bienvenue. Naila Kabeer and I have just spent the last couple of days at a conference here on women's economic empowerment. And while we talked about various barriers as well as opportunities, we certainly didn't talk about the extreme forms of gender discrimination, which will be the topic of this afternoon's presentation, and which lead to excessively high levels of female mortality relative to male mortality. Amartya Sen has described this as the phenomenon of missing women, namely the number of women there would be in a population if women's survival chances had been similar to those of men. The phenomenon of missing women has been described as one of the less noticed human catastrophes in the world today. One very startling statistic that I was given is that the numbers missing in the 1990s was larger than the combined casualties of all famines in the 20th century. That certainly gives us pause. Now, there are signs of improvement. While the absolute numbers of missing women have continued to increase with the increase in population, there nevertheless has been a decline in the percentage of missing women. Research supported by IDRC has shown that progress in the South Asian region has also been uneven. India, for instance, has experienced a worsening of its sex ratio over the closing decades of the 20th century. That said, the picture in neighbouring Bangladesh seems to be different, and there has been a steady improvement in the survival chances of girls relative to boys. Naila Kabeer today will help us to understand better what lies beneath these trends. Naila Kabeer is Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University. She's done extensive research on gender, labour markets, livelihoods, social protection, and citizenship issues, with a special focus on South Asia and Southeast Asia. Her books include Reversed Realities, Gender Hierarchies and Development Thought, The Power to Choose, Bangladeshi Women and Labour Market Decisions in London and Dhaka, Gender Mainstreaming and Poverty Eradication and the MDGs, and most recently, Gender and Social Protection in the Informal Economy. Naila Kabeer was also lead author of the 2009 World Survey on Women in Development for the United Nations, and Can the MDGs Provide a Pathway to Social Justice? The Challenge of Intersecting Inequalities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Naila Kabeer to today's talk at IDRC.
Let me start by talking about the whole issue of sex preference. This has been a long-standing problem, and it is not confined to South Asia. And I want to link it up to some of the literature which talks about the belt of classic patriarchy. And this stretches from northern Africa, across the Middle East, across the northern plains of India to Bangladesh, and it also includes East Asia, China, Korea, Taiwan. This belt of classic patriarchy, this is a phrase used by Denise Candioti, is characterized by certain features of family and kinship organizations in common. Family structures are patriarchal, so it is the senior male that makes decisions and controls younger men and the women in the family. Inheritance, principles of descent and inheritance are patrilineal, traced through the male line. You have patrilocal residence, so that after women get married, they go and live in the husband's house, and they're cut off from their own kin. And in many of these societies, you have a practice of female seclusion called parda, ghungat, and so on. This belt of classic patriarchy actually encompasses a number of religions, so it is not associated with any one religion. You have Islam, you have Hinduism, you have Confucianism, and so on, and Christianity. Partly because of the way kinship and family structures are set up, this is also a belt that has been characterized by strong son preference. So when we talk about the geography of gender, we can also talk about a geography of strong son preference. And these are the societies which were responsible for the missing women that Sen talked about, the much higher percentage of women than men that died in these populations. However, there have been improvements, as Sue said. There have been improvements across the world, but there has also been deterioration in some parts of the world. India, China, South Korea, though I have to say South Korea is now improving quite rapidly, and it holds out hope to all of us. But unfortunately, it's also been joined by countries where we did not expect this to happen. And for me, the most heartbreaking thing is that it's been joined by Vietnam, which is a country I've always held up as a model of, really egalitarian, empowered women. And unexpectedly, 3 Caucasian countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Furthermore, in these societies, the phenomenon of missing women is being replaced by the phenomenon of missing girls. Female life expectancy on the whole is improving, but amongst the 0 to 5, 6, 7-year-olds, excess female mortality continues, and it has now been joined by the practice of female selective abortion, which has been made possible by the use of ultrasound technology. And in a context where you're getting rapid fertility decline in all these countries, sex-selective abortion is a way in which parents are managing to lower their fertility rates, but at the same time achieve the sex composition that they desire. The India report, which was carried out by a number of colleagues and focused on some of the 5 worst states in India, Himachal, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Punjab, Haryana, and so on. We've seen sex ratios at birth, which is suggestive of sex-selective abortion, getting worse between 1998 and 2005. But not only that, we find that discrimination still persists amongst surviving children, so that the excess female mortality rates are higher in the 1 to 4 age group than in the 0 to 1 age group. So not only do we have the older forms of discrimination through malign neglect and so on, but we now have a new form of discrimination in the form of sex-selective abortion. And while these adverse sex ratios used to be concentrated in the northwestern states of India, they are now spreading apparently to other parts of India. And in the 2011 census, we find that there has been deterioration even in West Bengal and some of the eastern states, which were intermediate in the past. And while it used to be concentrated in the upper landed castes of northern India, we are also now finding it in spreading down the caste hierarchy. Now, the India report says that the deterioration in sex ratios cannot simply be explained in terms of a continuity with the past. In fact, you would expect to see a weakening of son preference if you believed what parents were telling our Indian researchers. There was a lot of discussion about men failing to find jobs, falling into bad habits, frequent references to worthless sons, and so on. But nevertheless, most families in the India research express preferences for either 1 son or 2 sons, or in certain sites, 2 sons and 1 daughter. But hardly any of them expressed a preference or had only daughters. So the India report says that the explanation cannot be sought in terms of a strengthening of son preference, but they opt instead for an explanation that talks about strengthening of daughter aversion. And this is a phrase that was coined by 2 Indian demographers called Iyer and Barua. And what they're saying is that the changes, certain changes that are taking place as India grows and develops, etc., is leading to the costs of having daughters being perceived as increasing. One is, of course, the rising costs of dowry, and it's spread across the caste system. Then there is the pressure to diversify out of agriculture because of pressure on land. And to diversify out of agriculture, you need education in order to get jobs. But increasing investments in education in daughters, while it may help them to get a suitable match in a class-caste differentiated marriage market, the returns to daughters are captured by the in-laws. And it is investment in sons, who they continue to rely on for security in old age, that they feel will bear fruit to the parents. So we turn to the Bangladesh. So this formed the backdrop of our research. And we found that it wasn't possible to try and explain the Bangladesh story without reference to the India story. Because many of the things that the Indian research reported, we found in Bangladesh, but it was having a very different set of outcomes. What we find in Bangladesh is both at the national census data and in one of the most comprehensive and long-standing demographic surveillance data in Matlab, we find that the gender differentials in mortality have been declining. And Sex ratios at birth show very little evidence of manipulation. They are the kind of sex ratios you find everywhere else. So not only are we not finding sex-selective abortion, but we're also finding that discrimination against daughters is going down. And the population of this overall sex ratio in Bangladesh is now quite balanced. Ultrasound technology was introduced much later in Bangladesh than in India. And this could be a part of the story. But there's, even now, very little evidence that it is being used to determine the sex of the fetus. We actually had, in one particular village where we did very detailed studies, we had people saying, there's a government ban on telling you what the sex of the fetus is. But actually, there is no such government ban. We found no evidence of a government ban. But somehow there seems to be, at least in this village and its environs, this belief that doctors are not allowed to reveal the sex of the fetus. There's also evidence of a weakening of son preference. So not only is behavior changing, but attitudes are changing. And while we can't always rely on attitudes, because of political correctness and so on, to tell us the truth, when behavior and attitudes match, then I think attitudes can be relied on to reveal something. So I actually did my PhD in a village in Bangladesh in 1979. And I collected data using what was then quite popular called the Coombs test. It's a scale. So rather than asking a direct question, do you want a boy or a girl, it asks people a series of questions in order to get a more nuanced picture of sex preference. So I'm just going to tell you the difference. And I went back to that village as a part of the IDRC research. Of course, we didn't interview the same people. We couldn't, but we interviewed a whole bunch of women. And I'll just share with you a little bit of the results. 1979, and we separated by age, okay? What is 1 to 3 is weak son preference, 4 is middling, and 5 to 7 is strong son preference. And I'll just very briefly say, if we look at strong son preference, 5 to 7, we see it's gone from 44% to 53% in 1979 to 22% and 20% in 2007. And I broke this down by land, et cetera, but, the story is the same. Parents are expressing much less strong son preference, and we are finding some evidence of a shift towards daughter preference. What we also did was we were a part of a major research program called Pathways of Women's Empowerment, which is partly funded by DFID, but we used the IDRC funding to piggyback onto that survey, and we added a question in that survey, which was a very straightforward question. If you could have only one child, would you want a boy, a girl, or you don't care? The responses varied. The 5,000 women were distributed amongst 8 districts. The responses varied considerably by district. 64% of women in Chandina, which is extremely religious and conservative, expressed son preference, compared to just 22% in Kurigram, which is the poorest of the sites. But the shift that we found was not so much from son preference to daughter preference. Very few percentages of people expressed daughter preference, but it was to indifference to the sex of the child. We carried out logistic regression analysis for 2 cohorts of the women in our survey, those from 15 to 29 and those from 30 up. I'll just report the findings of the survey. Amongst the older cohort, son preference was more likely to be expressed by widows, who are, of course, a vulnerable category, who need sons for some degree of protection, by women with no education relative to women with primary education. Secondary education effects were weak in the older cohort, maybe because not that many of them have had secondary education. Son preference was more likely to be expressed by Hindus relative to Muslims, and by women from poorer households relative to women from wealthier households. Interestingly, women's involvement in paid work did not have much impact on son preference. It was not significantly different between women who didn't work and women who did work. But women who felt that their work was valued by their family did express weaker son preference. And the women who said that their work was valued by their family were mainly women in formal work or informal outside work, followed by informal inside work. So it was not just the fact of paid work, but the fact of paid work being appreciated by the family And that did revolve around what kind of paid work. And location continued to matter. And this is a point I think I tried to make at the research meeting we had. We just capture location as a dummy variable. And then we look at all these individual and household characteristics. But here, location, it just, I am intrigued to know what it is about Kurigram and Chandina and Faridpur that made such a difference to the kinds of preferences that were being expressed. So I think at some stage we need to disaggregate location and find out what it is about location. Looking at the younger cohort, widows, not that many, but women who were not married were less likely to express some preference, and I guess the pressure wasn't on them yet. Women with secondary education, and here primary education no longer mattered, because most women have primary education now. So it was women with secondary education who were much less likely to express some preference, and husband's secondary education also mattered. So women who were married to men with secondary education were more likely to be indifferent to the sex of the child. Wealth status wasn't important amongst the younger generation. Indifference to the sex of the child crossed wealth barriers. But once again, as far as occupational status is concerned, it was women whose work was valued who expressed indifference to the sex of the child. Once again, Muslim women were less likely to express some preference than Hindu women. But in the younger generation, Muslim women who wore the hijab and the burda when they went out expressed stronger sun preference. So we find that religious conservatism is associated with stronger sun preference. And as I said, location continued to matter. So it isn't that sun preference has disappeared from Bangladesh. It's there, it's alive, but it's weakening. We did qualitative interviews we went back to my village and we did a lot of in-depth interviews there, but we also did interviews in about 3 other locations in order to get a wider picture of what the qualitative data would tell us about, what are the factors driving this. So, persistence of sun preference, we find the old attitudes, right? We want sons to brighten up the household. Everybody wants a son, so they hope for the future, who will look after them. Girls can't look after the household. But how many girls can look after their parents when they get married and they live somewhere else? And here's another woman, but watering the neighbor's tree. I've raised my daughter to go and live in someone else's house. She will not be able to come from her husband's house to live with me. Most people prefer sons. Girls marry and go somewhere else. Who will inherit my property? Sons will always remain by your side, and so on. And one other quote, if you have a daughter, you have to educate them and then give them a dowry. See, dowry has become a part of Bangladesh marital practices over the last 30 or 40 years. It was not there before. And many of the women, in fact, there was one quite funny woman who said, she was much older, she said, oh, no. She said, when I got married, there was no dowry. She said, dowry started 6 months after I got married. But, we still have a generation of women who did not pay dowry. So one has to give a whole lot of money. It's very difficult for parents. My husband is working. I'm working. We have to give 50,000 for daughters. It's a problem. I'm wasting away with tension, she said. That's why everyone wants a son. Now let's turn to those who don't express those views. And here's Farah from Faridpur. I've heard from a lot of people that they prefer daughters. Earlier, their faces would fall if they had a daughter. My aunt had a daughter. She tried to smother her with her hand. But if Allah decides to make her breathe, then who can stop him? I don't know if she actually killed him or not, but, that was happening. They were happy with their sons because they were able to bring their earnings home, but people don't feel like that anymore. They think girls are better. No, says Fauzia, I don't want any more children. With the little income that my husband earns, if I cannot bring up one daughter properly, there's no point in having any more children. It's not simply a question of having more children, it's a question of bringing them up. And this issue of bringing them up, in Bengali we call it manush kora, making them people, making them human beings. That featured a lot. You have to educate your daughter, you have to educate your son. Then another woman from Chandina, the most conservative. For my first child, I was happy with whatever Allah gave me. I did not wish for a boy or a girl. I don't know what my family wanted. I like both. But nowadays, girls are better. They understand their mother's pain and hardship. Boys don't understand that well. Now, I want to just pick up on that because in past research I've written, about how many women struggle with whatever money they have, whether it's microfinance or whatever, to educate their daughters. They do not want their daughters to live the lives that they lived. They want the daughters to have the education to stand up to abusive husbands, to walk out of abusive marriages, to have a bit of money of their own, and so forth. And this came up again and again in past research I've done. So when I hear this, they understand their mother's pain and hardship. I also know the mother wants to save them the pain and hardship that the mothers had to go through. It's good to have both daughters and sons. There's no loss in either. They're both beneficial. If daughters are brought up as proper human beings, they will look after their parents. Whereas nowadays you see that even after getting educated, sons do not even recognize their parents. You need both a son and a daughter. So you can see the kinds of forces that are at work. But there's one other thing which struck me almost with the first interview we did. And that was what I call in a very loose way, it's the rise of the daughter-in-law. The daughter-in-law was this oppressed, badly treated person in the household, and the mother-in-law ruled the roost. Mother-in-law, that was her only form of power ever. It's only when the daughters started to have children, to have sons, that the daughter-in-law started to rise. Well, things are changing. I think TV is to blame. People are having romantic marriages. Husbands are turning much more to their wives and their children. So there's this emotional nucleation that Jack Caldwell talked about, more nuclear families. Parents are finding suddenly that control that they used to exercise over their sons and their daughters-in-law is no longer guaranteed. But that, what we call in Bengali maya, affection or compassion, that the daughter seems to have, they feel somehow investing in the daughter, perhaps the daughter will one day look after them in their old age. So there's been a shift in expectations from daughters-in-law and sons to the daughters. And in our villages, we did find that daughters would sometimes working and would send money or help to their parents, sometimes with their husband's permission or his knowledge, but very often not telling the in-laws. So something has happened, and in our larger research, TV was a huge factor in changing people's thinking and opening up new ideas. In Bangladesh, and I didn't see this in the India research, there is constant references to the value of women has risen. The value of women has risen. And I heard it again and again. Mede dam bere geche, In fact, some people say, women now rule the country. Well, actually they do. Not very well, but they do. One factor behind this is education, and we have seen closing of the gender gap at primary level and at secondary level. And it's such a cliche, but education is a force for change. It is a force for change. Of course, better education would be a better force for change, but even the pretty bad quality education that we are getting is a force for change. Secondly, employment. And employment is occurring in all kinds of different ways. And even though it didn't emerge in the quantitative data as a son preference factor, it emerged as a very systematic predictor of women's empowerment on all the other indicators that we had. And employment, and especially formal, semi-formal employment, quasi-formal, working in an NGO or as a community health worker or whatever, not necessarily a posh government job. But employment is coming through government health programs. In fact, paid work, the biggest increase has been in the social sector, as teachers and health workers and so on, insurance agents and so on. Microfinance, much maligned and so on, but giving women an opportunity to earn some income of their own, an opportunity that was never there before. The garment factory, it only employs 3 million, but it holds out prospects of employment to many, many other million of women. Women are migrating. So there are in all kinds of different ways. And some of the quotations from our research, one woman said, you can always tell a working woman, it's the way she carries herself. So from a situation, what my early research had shown, of women having to beg for every single penny from their husbands, these women now have income of their own. And husbands don't take away their incomes. You don't. You're not all bad guys that you just want to take away your wife's money. You I had an experience with a husband once. He says, "Oh, my wife has these secret savings." I said, "How do you know? That's secret." And he said, "Oh no, all women, they hide money in the rice pot and so on." So women do have some control over their income, and they are being able to help their parents. And so there has been. I don't want to be over optimistic, or I have this tendency, but I think there has been a sea change in gender relations in Bangladesh. And somebody who's been doing work on sexual and reproductive rights for DFID as well agrees with me that what we find also is that domestic violence is coming down in many homes. We need more data on that. But she thinks so. My data tells me in many places it's not acceptable. It's becoming less acceptable. And then, of course, the other change is actually just values and perceptions, what I've been talking about. And here, the whole discourse around gender equality, women's rights, etc., has been carried to the grassroots level by media. For every television owned in the countryside, 10 people actually get to watch it. Through newspapers, through government declarations, that people are convinced that everything good that happens, I don't know why, but they think everything good that happens in the country, the government did it, So girls' education, microfinance. I remember they kept talking about the garment factories. Of course, the government has done this. And I realized in Bengali, when you say garment, you often say government. And I think a lot of them might actually have thought there was the government who had put the garment factories into place for them. I don't know. That's a thought. But government, media, NGOs carrying values right down to the grassroots level, migration, and so on. So there is a change. There is a huge change at rural. Again, uneven change, as we've seen in our 8 locations. In Chandina, we have very conservative views. In the poorest places, perhaps not so conservative. So going back to the India story, here we have 2 countries where the forces of change have not been that different. Bangladesh is poorer, but poverty has been coming down. It has grown at not as spectacular rates as India, but reasonably steadily, 4-5% a year. So what is it that explains the differences? One is it could be the timing of the technology. The fact that ultrasound technology came to Bangladesh quite late. It's not particularly sophisticated. It isn't those small, cheap, portable machines that you have all over, India, very accessible. So it may be that simply the technology has not arrived in a big way. One reason I feel not inclined to accept that, and it may be the need for me to believe that this is not the case, is that, the private sector is distributing ultrasound technology. So if there was a demand for it, I would have assumed we would have seen a supply. People aren't that poor that they can't afford to use this kind of technology. And they are using it, but often quite late in the birth, so 4 or 5 months, by which time, abortion is not legal in Bangladesh, but menstrual regulation is, which is abortion by another name, abortion without a pregnancy test. So technology could be a part of the story, that we simply have not seen the spread of ultrasound technology. Second part of the story could be something to do with the state or society. Now, Bangladesh state is not renowned for good governance. In fact, on the contrary, it's renowned for pretty awful governance. India has had an almost uninterrupted track record of democracy. So I don't think we can look to, government, quality of governance somehow. But we could look at society. And there are 2 things that distinguish India and Bangladesh. One is the huge presence of the NGO sector. The failure of the state has been accompanied by a proliferation of NGOs. And NGOs, for better or for worse, are the carriers of sort of semi-secular values, progressive values. They need their donor funding, they all say the right things, but people believe them, So you've got the NGOs as a real, like a capillary force for change right through society amongst very poor people and so on. And the other, of course, is we do not have a caste system. We have class, But it hasn't got the feudalism of Pakistan, and it doesn't have the caste stratification of India. In fact, there's a saying that is often quoted in Bangladesh by a poor farmer who says, "Today I am a weaver, tomorrow I will become a sheikh, and day after tomorrow, God willing, I will become a sayyid." Which means I will become, more and more, I will be practically descended from the Prophet if things go right. So there's a sort of a fluidity in the way people look at mobility. So it could be that ideas travel faster because they don't have to leap over caste barriers. So that's another thing. Then there's religious values. And there's a number of demographers called Iyer and Barua who've published a paper in the World Bank who have focused very much on religious values and looked at the difference between Hindus and Muslims. But it seems to me that religious values never stay immutable. Whatever religion says, change happens in so many different directions that holding on to values that no longer make sense or that don't chime with, modern forces, that doesn't seem a very satisfactory explanation. But a more satisfactory explanation, I think, comes from some of the practices, marital practices, associated with the different communities. And here, this is emphasized very much in the India report. And it kind of alerted me to the differences in marriage practices between India and Bangladesh. In India, you have, let me try and get this right, you have caste endogamy. You have to marry within your caste. You have marital hypergamy. You have to marry within your caste, but women marry higher status. And the dowry is a recognition of the fact that the woman is marrying into a higher status. You have village exogamy, so women leave their villages. And you have lineage exogamy, so they leave their own families. So you have quite a complex series of requirements for a woman to make a good marriage, right? And dowry has been very much a part of the marital practices, and it is getting bigger and more burdensome, and as the India report says, spreading across different castes. In Bangladesh, we have village exogamy. You marry outside your village. But there is no ban on lineage endogamy. Muslims may have cross-cousin marriages. They do much more in Pakistan, less in Bangladesh, but there's no big deal about it. Hypergamy, no. You want to marry your daughter off to the best catch possible. Best that he has a steady job or, the usual stuff. But there isn't any caste requirements attached to that marriage. And dowry is very recent. As I said, it's really the last 30 or 40 years. So I feel like this business of daughter aversion that has been picked up in the Indian literature may reflect the burdens of marrying off your daughter. And of course, everyone has to be married, men and women, but particularly women. So I find that a more plausible set of explanations may lie in the way that caste is interacting with the forces of modernization and the kinds of, the way that this is being picked up by different groups of people. Two more possible explanations. One is some of the most discriminatory practices around gender have been practiced by the upper landed castes. This was pointed out by an anthropologist called Barbara Miller in the 1980s in a book called Endangered Sex, and it has been picked up by Agnihotri and so on and so forth. But what may be the case, and this is speculation, right, because we have no concrete way of providing evidence, but there is a phenomenon called Sanskritization in South Asia. You emulate people in higher status than you. So it may be that many of the practices like the ban on widow remarriage and dowries spreading to other castes as they seek to signal upward mobility. So that's another possibility. My final possible explanation is, and this is another odd one, so I'm just throwing it out. When we talk about the belt of classic patriarchy, Bangladesh is at the very edge of it, So it never got as well incorporated into the classic patriarchal kinship system as did other countries. So there's a big difference, for instance, in the Islam practiced in Bangladesh and the Islam practiced in Pakistan. There's been much more openness to change in Bangladesh. And it may be precisely because it straddles the border between classic patriarchy and its very unequal gender relations and the more egalitarian systems of Southeast Asia, starting with Burma, about which we know nothing. So finally, policy lessons. It was very difficult. We had a workshop. We brought in people from Vietnam, China, India, Bangladesh. And it was very clear that, these little piecemeal interventions are not going to work. The government of India in one of the states is giving parents a sum of money if they have daughters, to compensate for the daughter and so on. That's not going to work. You need a sea change in attitudes of the kind that you're beginning to see in Bangladesh. And so I think the answer lies in harnessing the power of the institutions that shape public perceptions and public discourse. You have to harness the power of education, of media, civil society, of government, and they all have to be singing the same tune. They all have to be speaking the same message, that we cannot go into the 21st century as one of the growing powers in the world with this on our conscience. So I think advocacy, media, television. By the way, there is evidence that television, cable TV, in villages with cable TV, son preference expressed is weaker. I don't know what to do with that information, but there you are. I think promoting more and better jobs for women at all levels, and that means at the highest level, not just at the very poorest level, but the models for women are women in the elite and middle classes. So for more and more women to get desirable jobs, I think would also give a signal that girls are indeed your wealth, Expanding social security provision, perhaps, old age, insurance. We know that for a lot of people, and we hear it in the interviews, sons are still your, most what you hope for to look after you in your old age. And I think the government could become the most visible advocate for gender equality and women's rights. And I don't know about any of the Indians here, and I know that when the Indians came to our workshop, they felt that the government could do much, much more. I think some very senior government servants are still in denial that there is a problem. So that's it.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. I think you've taken that headline of the missing middle and really helped us to start, or the missing women, and helped us to start unpacking it into the really complex differences between families and locations, and also I think it's sobering to think about the long-term policy implications, particularly as I think donors always, but in this particular moment, are also thinking much more short-term in terms of we want to see results, and that's not the kind of change that you're talking about. Let's open it up for questions. If you're okay with this, we'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and then we can continue the discussion. There's a microphone over here and over at the other side. So perhaps you can also just line up at the microphone so we can go a little bit more quickly. We'll start over here, please.
Professor Kabeer, my question is preceded by a comment. And the comment is that...
Can I just have you identify yourselves as well?
My name is Praveen Yogi, and I work for Industry Canada, but I'm making this comment in a purely personal way. By the way, I come from the same part of the world as Professor Kabeer does. It's just on the other side of the border. Professor Kabeer, my comment is that the one other country where you have this problem in spades is in China. Mm-hmm. And there you don't have the religious factors that you have in a Hindu society and caste. And I don't know whether they have the dowry problem or not. But that's the comment, that both countries share one factor. NGOs are very weak. The question is this: is the Indian data detailed enough that you can compare the Bangladesh results with 2 states, West Bengal and Kerala?
Go to the side, please. Jane Parpart from Carlton. It's a wonderful talk and fascinating. I've just finished living in Trinidad for the last 4 years, and Trinidad is 45% Indo-Trinidadian, and one of the things very interesting there is that one thing that happened, they say, on the long journey was that quite a few people seem to have moved up caste. over the journey. And so there a disproportionate number of Singhs and Maharishes and, the Brahmin population is disproportionate for what you would expect for people going out to get indentured labor jobs. And it's interesting that in the early years of the 1800s, when they were first there, not only was there this change in percentage of people who were seeing themselves as moving up, but there was also a very strong effort to control women, to marry them very early, and there was an intense amount of patriarchal pressure. And I think a lot of this fits in with your argument of trying to assume a kind of upper caste kind of behavior. One of the things that has altered this is that in the early 1900s, missionaries from Canada, from Nova Scotia of all places, came in and set up schools, Presbyterian schools, and insisted on educating women. And the women's population went from a very tiny percentage of educated people to now a massive percentage of the women are professionals. In fact, this is the biggest increasing group of professionals in the country, and the Prime Minister is now an Indo-Trinidadian woman. But one of the things that's also happening is a rise in gender-based violence. So that there is, in fact, I think, education in this case, what was important was the education for girls, not so much for boys. And I wonder in India if that isn't one of the problems, because I was told by someone from IDRC that, in fact, the higher your caste in India, the more inclined you are to favor son preference. So that education for the males and many females doesn't seem to have made so much difference. But perhaps education more aimed at women might make a difference. And my question is also, what is the role of women activists in this? And not only women activists, but also thinking of the country of Japan. Japan doesn't have a very overt women's, sort of effort or project, but it has had an enormously important change recently. In the last 20 years, the marriage rate of young women has dropped by 20%. There's a huge number of women who are now employed. They can live independently. They don't have to marry, and they're choosing not to marry. So that's a form of resistance. I wonder if that kind of resistance exists anywhere in places like India or this patriarchal belt.
Rob Robertson, that was a terrific presentation, Naila. Thank you very much. A quick question about television. Is the programming Western television that's coming in and changing the cultural values in Bangladesh, or is it indigenous productions that are doing that? And if so, are they consciously produced with a view to trying to change the view of women?
Let's start with those.
Okay. You're right. And I don't think we can have a general explanation, okay? I think, when one looks at the Bangladesh-India story, obviously religion appears in some form or other. Particularly as in India, we know that sex ratios are more favorable amongst the minority Muslims, and in Bangladesh we're finding that son preference is stronger among the Hindus. I do think there are two aspects of religion that cover both China and India, and I'm not a religious expert, so I'm just throwing this out as an idea. And that is both Confucianism and Hinduism require a son to carry, to light the funeral pyre, to perform the ancestral rites, to usher the person into the afterlife. And I think, this is just throwing it out. It's not something I would write, because I would need much more knowledge of these things. But it struck me that is one of the things that characterizes the two great blocks where this is happening. NGOs, I don't know what sort of... but in terms, I think it would be fascinating, not so much even Kerala, but just West Bengal and Bangladesh, I think would be a fascinating comparison. And I think I tried to persuade Nafsharan to go and fund some of this research in West Bengal. Because while we say we have a shared culture, etc., the two Bengals have a particularly close cultural, heritage. However, as I said, very sadly, I think the 2011 census has seen a 10 percentage point drop in this. I mean, it's got worse by 10 percentage point in West Bengal. I think for the first time we're seeing that. On the caste, on education, we know that in where's Jane? we know from Monica Dasgupta's work in 1987 and more recent work that some of the most educated women in India are the most efficient at practicing sex ratio manipulation. But I think one of the things that happened in Bangladesh is, like your missionaries, the government of Bangladesh actually gave preferential educational scholarships for girls to get them through secondary education and to try and postpone the age of marriage. That's one thing that hasn't shifted very rapidly in Bangladesh, is age of marriage. And I think it's a security issue or whatever. So obviously education makes a difference. And we know from Sen and Vreja's work, literacy and employment and all these things make a difference. But I think we're always looking at the sort of exceptional women in a population of largely uneducated and not working people. I think one needs to have that spread across the population too. One other interesting thing, again, to throw out is Bangladesh has made enormous strides on the MDG type indicators. And these a lot of them are dependent on behavioral change. Immunization, sanitation, clean water, all of that. So somehow these ideas, whether it's through NGOs or whatever, they don't have to go through that caste barrier. They just travel, right? And I feel that education is a part of the story, but it has to be a mass education. And I wonder if the curriculum of the education could also be, because I think as Nivedita Rao says, when you codify particular aspects of Hinduism, it was very much Brahmin-style Hinduism. It wasn't, it wasn't a more fluid kind of Hinduism that would accommodate change more easily. So I guess education, but quality of education, the messages in education, and we are facing, as you said, it's an unacknowledged tragedy. And how does it feel to be a girl in a society where so many of you are missing? I don't see the Japanese option open now to many people in South Asia. I think the idea of not marrying, I think, for Bangladeshi women, Indian women, is still maybe some urban women, but I think it's not much of an option yet. The jobs are not there, the kind of jobs that they have. And in South Korea, where things were getting worse until about the mid-1990s, and then suddenly we saw a turnaround. And I don't think we've understood yet what helped to turn around. Certainly South Korea made it illegal for doctors to carry out such sex-selective abortions, but hardly anyone got arrested. So I think, again, it's the tightening of the labor market, the moving up of women up the occupational ladder, and a fairly active women's movement with democratization, much more active. But, until we take these things and study them, it's very hard. Because Monica Dasgupta has written about South Korea, but she talks about norms, but I'm very unsatisfied with her way of defining norms, because it's one of those black boxes. Exactly what are these norms? And the TV question, they don't watch Western stuff particularly. Many of them have cable. They watch a lot of Indian soaps and stuff. And they watch a lot of talk shows. There's a lot, Bengalis like to talk. And they're constantly on the show, My cousin is like a celebrity because she goes on these talk shows. I go to some little district town, to the internet cafe, and people go, "Oh, Appa, I've seen you on TV," So there's a lot of political talk shows, but they will say that, when someone throws acid at you, which is something that people charmingly do, we know now where to go. So there's information also being provided. But I think the other thing about TV is actually the notion of romantic love. I think there's a lot of that going on. People going in for, seeing marriage much more as a companionship, as a partnership between, people bringing up their children. And I have to say, one of the extraordinary, we didn't use the quotes as much, is a number of women who said, my husband just only ever wanted daughters. He only ever wanted daughters. And that is extraordinary, because you always think it's the mother who will want. So a lot of things, and seeing the prime minister as a woman and the opposition person as a woman, and I don't know. It needs a whole study, I think, to understand. And we found it in Afghanistan as well. The TV was a huge process through which women got a window into the rest of the world, rather than being closed off in their societies.
Hi, my name is Adrian DiGiovanni, and I work at IDRC on legal issues. And I wanted to piggyback on Rob's comment, which shows that lawyers maybe think similarly. And I had a similar question in my mind, whether it was Western influences, but at the very least, it sounds like you mentioned at least three main external influences in changing attitudes. And the first is the television, because this idea of romantic love, it's quite compelling, and it's very, very nice. It's romantic. That strikes me as a set of values or norms, ideas that have come from other cultures. You've also mentioned NGOs, who are more savvy and secularized in dealing with external donors, who are also bringing a whole array of value structures and human rights obligations, everything else. And also this idea of upward social mobility. I suspect people are taking cues from urban professional elite classes, who probably also are appealing to some homogenized, globalized idea of what does it mean to be rich and sophisticated. And so I don't want to take away from the positive aspects, because it does sound definitely like the glass is half full. But it sounds like it very much is sort of a Western or globalized notions that are coming in, or just external. And so the question I have then is, are there trade-offs that are coming? Is there a negative aspect? And again, I don't want to draw generalizations about outside or Western cultures, but it could possibly be more individualization or materialism in society, or just switching values and perceptions. So I was wondering if you've seen trade-offs, or the sort of negative side of the posture.
Yeah. I think there's a whole, again, the people who are working on sexual and reproductive rights will tell you that there is a whole burgeoning industry in pornography, which I see as a Western import. There's a lot, consumerism, very much. People putting a lot of emphasis on the same, kind of. But this is not so much in the village level, right? But small towns, urban areas, and so on. So you see that. This is some of the thing, in all future research, I think the work on gender really has to bring in men and boys, because there is a feeling that boys are getting left behind and men are being ignored, and a resentment. So although I think domestic violence may be going down, I think violence against women in the public arena, various sexual assaults, etc., I don't think that's going down. It may be going up. So I think the things that held society under control and maintain, that's beginning to fall apart. And the way in which NGOs have gone, and because they have been so driven by microfinance, an alternative vision of justice has not been part of their agenda. So it's become very, very market-driven, each individual entrepreneur making whatever money they can and so on. But nothing that will make people come together to challenge corruption in the government, or, to seek to participate in politics and so on. So I think those are the more negative aspects. Bangladesh is not a nice place in many ways, and I have to harp on my favorite topic, which is traffic, modernization, westernization, and traffic. And, ADB building highways in a country where people don't know how to drive and don't know that there's such a thing as a highway code. And, traffic accidents. And just about a month ago, the most promised filmmaker just died in a traffic accident. And, So it's all happening so fast that I feel like, and because we have such inadequate leaders, there's no attempt to kind of manage the process in a way that there aren't too many casualties along the way.
We'll take these three speakers if we can.
It was a wonderful presentation coming from Bangladesh.
Oh.
Yes, my name is Samina. I worked at University of Dhaka for almost 14, 15 years, and now I'm doing my PhD at Carleton University. So one of the things that really drew me to this session was the idea of sex indifference. Well, my data set or my research area is focusing on engineering and technology, basically the high tech. Whereas we are seeing women underrepresentation in this sector, in the Western context, we are seeing a rise in Eastern context, and namely my example comes from Bangladesh. And I have found in the preliminary study that I did with the engineering student 850, I saw there is a gender neutrality that the students are seeing, that, oh no, this is not a male domain, this is not a female domain kind of work. So I was wondering that because you have done so much of studies, can you help me understand how gender is conceptualized in this part of the world? How the notion of gender neutrality...
In relation to technology?
No, in general. Because we are seeing... there was a report a couple of months back where we are 6th or 7th gender gap in terms of political leadership. The gender gap is so low. There were 4 different dimensions. I forgot the name of the report. So I was just wondering that how this notion of sex indifference or gender neutrality, which is spreading through media, well, that's there in my paper, that media is playing a role, the education and the occupation of the prestige of the occupation. These are maybe the underlying factors, same-sex education, everything. So I was just wondering how, as an expert, can you help me understand this part? Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Naila. I'm Eileen Alma from IDRC. One of the things that really intrigued me by what you were talking about was value of work. And I found that really interesting that you were able to look at sort of varying levels of work, both at the formal and the semi-formal and the informal, to sort of get at a sense of why things are changing for women and for preferences for girls and women. And you also mentioned within that, not very much, but a little bit about migration. And this, I think, is one of the things that sort of distinguishes Bangladesh, and I might be wrong, from India, really, in many cases, because you do see a much higher percentage of women work migration from Bangladesh than you do in the other case. And, you know, as another IDRC sort of topic of research over the last few years, looking at the value of women's work through migration has certainly been an interesting thing, both positive and negative, certainly for the woman herself. But one of the things that it does do is raise a level of standing within the family in terms of being able to provide and so on. And I'm wondering if that has had, or if you've gone into any depth at all in the research about what is really happening when it comes to women's work migration in terms of how it might be really relating to this preference of women. On the rise, or this neutrality, if you will. Because now, in this case, for many cases, not all, but they are contributing in a way that is helping the household, and not necessarily a marriage household, a household of, you know, as a single woman in many respects. That might be also a contribution to dowry. So is that something that you went into in some depth with? And if you did, if you could elaborate a little more, that would be good.
Thank you very much. My Ariel Nahan. I'm at the Inclusive Growth team here at IDRC. Thank you very much for a very important talk. I won't say it's a fascinating talk, because the subject is just too painful to just complement it in academic terms. So I think it's very important. We're very grateful that you come to us and talk about this. I think the data is incredibly important. I hope you will have. I know in India, one of the very, very powerful things is that they've shown maps where the worsening sex ratio per district is shown up in red. And if you want to convince, I'm convinced that there's lots of policymakers in India that do not accept this story, right? I mean, as you indicated. So clear data with maps and then to show that Bangladesh is doing better at the macro level as well as the micro data, I think is incredibly important. I had one question and one comment. The question is, I'm not quite clear where you see both in India and in Bangladesh an increase in dowry, a huge increase in dowry, which is part of and changing social relations to an enormous extent. The difference seems to be that in India, it seems related to worsening sex ratio, and that link somehow seems broken in Bangladesh. And I don't quite understand that, because dowry in the end is a sign of the devaluation or undervaluation of women. So I'm not quite sure how you explain that. The comment was and is on the on India and religion. We've already seen how dangerous it is to talk about religion. We won't go into details, but I think it's actually very important, partly academic, partly political, because it will be misused so easily, right? The discrimination of women by Muslims in Europe is now a main, is used as a main excuse to make life of immigrants in Europe miserable, and the debate on religion doesn't always help in that. In this case, I think we need to be very careful in that, because what we're saying is right or wrong, but because of the use that is made of it, and we've already seen that. Now, in the Indian case, I think it is actually, I'm actually not that convinced that religion is that explanatory factor, and the reason for that is that the huge differences in North and South India, traditionally at least, of course, these sex ratio differences are spreading to South India, but the south of India, which was most deeply Hindu, the most entrenched caste practices, didn't traditionally have those practices. So from this. Right. So there's lots of other factors, but religion doesn't. The North and South India divide does not, tells you exactly the opposite. And on top of that, one of the states that where the some preference was most stark earlier was of course Punjab, which isn't predominantly Hindu anyway. So it somehow just doesn't fit. Now the important thing is the academic debate. We can go on about that, but the use that is then made of the way it's politicized when we say religion, I think is in a way my main cause. Like we need to be very careful about that. But thank you for a very important talk.
On the gender neutrality, sex indifference, I see it as part. I keep losing Louise. I see it as part of some of the changes that we're seeing. It's interesting with technology because there is no prior, cultural. This was not an arena where men and women used to work. And that's what's so great about ICTs, and computers. There's no precedent for it to be seen as purely male. So I think it's possible for women to come and, mobile phones and so on. Maybe that's it, but you don't agree. That's fine. I don't know anything about it, so I'm just hazarding a guess. What was the second one? Migration. We didn't look into migration in any great detail, but I would imagine certainly a lot of women are migrating into the towns in search of jobs, and that mobility is a very important factor in opening up new worlds and, providing more income and so on. So I see them migrate. And then, of course, there are many migrating abroad, but they are an understudied group. I think some research has been done of them, but it's very clear that the number of women who are actually migrating are way more than the numbers that the government is talking about. And I think that is a fascinating study, because you've got these women going from villages to, all kinds of different countries, often on their own, and doing all kinds of, work that they certainly weren't brought up to do. So we really don't know enough about that. And I think there's an interesting study to look at how migrating to different parts of the world, the differences in impact. So a person who goes to Saudi Arabia, a woman who goes to Saudi Arabia, a woman who goes to Malaysia, a woman who goes to Italy, they will be carrying back quite different kinds of values. And that would be quite fascinating to see how that plays out. But in terms of the sex preference and son preference, we didn't really look at it. The dowry, Ariane, the main difference is that dowry is not, till about 20 or 30 years ago, the transfer of wealth favored the bride's side, right? That was the direction of wealth transfer at marriage. It was the bride's side. This is a relatively new phenomenon. And I don't know how deep-rooted it is. And again, because we did our work slightly differently in the India study and the Bangladesh study, in the Bangladesh study, we got a lot of parents and a lot of women saying, I'm not going to give dowry. Now, on the one hand, dowry is, it's a very, if you want to marry off your daughter, but, if your daughter's fair and beautiful, maybe you can get away with not paying dowry if she's got an education. But there's much more talk in our study about we won't pay dowry. Okay? So I don't know how deep-rooted it is. And another study that was done by some of my colleagues in Bangladesh also found that the amount of money paid in dowry by Hindus and Muslims is much larger in the Hindu community, much larger. So I think it's much more embedded within that, it has a more longer history. On the religious stuff, I really don't want to go into too much detail, but again, I think there has been a study done which does an interaction between religion and region, part of India. And in general, it found that the religious factor still mattered, except perhaps in the northeast or, something. And I can't remember the study, I haven't cited it, but it's worth. But again, I take your point. I probably shouldn't dwell too much on these religious issues, because actually it's not the values per se. It's the way you organize your marriage, your kinship, all of these. And as we saw, this is a part of that whole patriarchal belt structure, and we see it in China, and despite several years of socialism, we're seeing it in Vietnam, despite several years of socialism. So religion is clearly... And the other thing, of course, is the 3 Caucasian countries which are suddenly out of the blue doing sex-selective abortions, 2 are Christian and 1 is Muslim. Azerbaijan is a Muslim country, and Armenia and Georgia are majority Christian countries. So, it's not like one religion is somehow responsible. And as you say, Sikhs are also implicated in some of this kind of these practices. But I take your point.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I know we had one over here.
Hi, Dr. Kabeer. My name is Devinder Nijawan. I work here at IDRC. I enjoyed your presentation very much. Related to what Ariane was talking about, I was wondering why there has been an increase in dowry. If it had sort of diminished, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, why? What are the social forces that are causing it to come back? Mm-hmm. And also, I wanted to respond very quickly to a point that Rob had made. In terms of the role of the media, I know that in India, there's a lot of production of soaps that people watch. I sit there watching them with my mom all the time, and some of them are fluff, about the mean, wicked mother-in-law, but others actually, really touch upon social issues affecting women. And that perhaps is also causing some awareness in some areas.
Dowry. Well, on the one hand, I don't think the explanation is the same for India and Bangladesh. What people have been saying is that dowry is now spreading from the castes where it was practiced, to other castes. And some people discuss it in terms of Sanskritization, some people discuss it in terms of, the old roles that women were able to play within subsistence agriculture, those are being eroded, and it's men that are getting jobs in the cash economy and so on. In Bangladesh also, it was around, it started out as like a voluntary thing, and it started out in the educated classes. And it was about if you wanted your daughter to marry a civil servant, you kind of paid for it. But it took on a life of its own. And by the 70s, it became known as demand dowry. It used to be voluntary. There was some subtle hints about it. By the 70s, it became a demand. And in Bengali, in the villages of Bangladesh, it's known as demand. Dowry is called, we didn't do demand. So the word in Bengali is now demand because it's become such a pressure. But having said that, I would be very it is mentioned again and again in our interviews, etc. But at the same time, we also hear a lot of people saying, no, we're not going to pay dowry, it's, can't afford it, don't want to do it, and so on. So I can't give you an explanation, a proper explanation, but those are the kinds of factors that seem to have led it. And what was very interesting, when I did the work with the garment factory workers, a lot of them said, no, of course, they had love marriages, and they'd say, my husband won't ask for a dowry because I am the dowry. I come with earning power.
That's actually, I think, a very nice note on which to end, especially, as I think Ariane reminded us, this is a very important topic, even though, for the most part, it's a very sobering topic. And I think, you've helped us to think about some of those underlying social attitudes and change that takes place over a long time and in very complex ways that we still need to understand more about. So if you would please join me, thank you for joining us, and thank you to Professor Naila Kabeer.
Thank you very much for letting me